All right, to Peter's right here, we have Connie Hedegaard, and Connie is the European Commissioner for Climate Action, and she also hosted the UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen last December. Before that, she was Denmark's Minister of Environment, and in her previous life, Connie was the star anchorwoman at the current affairs show, Deadline. Welcome, Connie.
Thanks.
To Connie's right, we have Kannan Lakmeeharan, who is the managing director of ESKOM. Now, ESKOM is the South African utility that supplies 95% of the country's electricity, and more amazingly, 45% of all of Africa's electricity. Welcome, Kannan. And to Kannan's right, we have Peter Seligmann, who is the co-founder and chairman and CEO of Conservation International. That's a Washington, D.C. NGO with 30 global offices and nearly 1,000 employees. They work all over the world, but especially in Africa. They work in jungles and deserts to bring in the local people and help them create jobs that will also conserve the environment at the same time. Peter, welcome. Connie, I'd like to start with you. Could you please give our audience just a brief update of where we are on climate change science right now? I don't want to get into a big debate, but what's your view?
I could speak for longer than you would like me to on what I've just learned coming on my way to here through Mali, one of the West African countries where millions and millions of people are already suffering from climate change. But just to give you one example of what science tells us, because I know that many of the Europeans, many in the US, they would say, didn't we have a very cold winter? So maybe the alarm has been called off. Mm-hmm. But just one example what science tells us. March this year was the hottest March ever recorded globally. April this year was the hottest April ever recorded globally. And also our last month, was the hottest May ever recorded globally. Just one evidence that because we are now very much preoccupied with the economic challenges that we are faced with, the climate challenge did not go away. On the contrary, it's still there, and that is a rather strong message from science still.
Okay, great, terrific. Now, also, Connie, if you could just briefly bring us up to date on what's been happening post-Copenhagen. A lot of people have said that the results coming out of Copenhagen were a disappointment. We didn't get an international agreement on limiting carbon. Has there been any progress since then? And if so, what?
In one sense, yes. I think that if we had met 12 months back, then we had not seen a lot of countries setting domestic targets as they actually did in the last months up to Copenhagen. The mobilization up to Copenhagen meant that, say, Indonesia, Mexico, Korea, China, India, also here in South Africa, lots and lots of countries, Japan, Russia, came up with targets for the first time ever, or they strengthened the targets that they had. Mm-hmm. In that sense, right now, governments are trying to find out how then to live up to the domestic targets. Right. So we should not forget that although negotiations at the international negotiations are still progressing much too slow, then something is actually happening in the different economies because of the mobilization, because of the pressure, they actually had to set domestic targets, and they're trying to deliver on that.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to Kannan. Kannan, South Africa is a great example of well, to me, it's sort of a dilemma in a way. Your government has set CO2 reduction levels very aggressively, I think 34% by 2020, is that correct? And then at the same time, South Africa has just received a $3 billion loan from the World Bank to build a huge coal plant. It's 4,800 megawatts. To give you an idea of what that means, that's the equivalent of 5 nuclear power plants in one coal facility. So what's up with that?
I think to give some context, the decisions to build these plants that we're building 2 plants, was made in 2004. And that is in the context of a very real crisis we are facing in the energy supply of the country coming on. And we saw that in 2008. So we were already late in building the power stations. And obviously, South Africa was familiar with building coal-fired power stations, had the resource, and had to get going. But clearly, now things have changed. We have to finish that. It's needed for energy security in the next 5 to 7 years. But after that, based on what South Africa has to do in terms of its responsibility, and it's shared, as we call shared and differentiated responsibility, it has to do certain things. And those decisions are coming this year. We have to complete the current plant, and I think everyone understands that. We've got to do it to the most efficient technology at this stage. But future choices will have to be made now, and that will be based on a lot of criteria. So that's where we are.
But alternatives such as solar and less so wind are more expensive than coal. You're telling me that coal power is relatively inexpensive in this country. So how do you get affordable power in a place like South Africa?
Yeah. No, it's a huge dilemma, and I don't actually have an answer for you. I think it's a combination. Clearly, with the current costs of technology, excluding the cost of any externality, carbon taxes, and so on, we understand that we can afford coal, and even then it is expensive, relatively, because you put in on new assets. But the other technologies, in terms of the financing, and that's the point, it's about how do you finance these technologies, requires a significant step change in tariff or an explicit subsidy by government. And that is the affordability issue.
Right.
Not taking into account future costs and so on. So that's important.
Okay.
But it's a combination. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So you're building coal plants. China's building dozens of coal plants. Other places in the developing world are embracing coal. Peter Seligmann, what can we do about that? I mean, can we counteract the effect of all these coal plants in terms of climate change with say, tackling deforestation?
We have to understand that even if we had new technologies in place right now, it will take us 20 to 30 years to actually get them into the grid and to get up to scale. So the best case scenario is that we will have some new technologies in place 20 or 30 years from now, operating at a scale. We have to immediately begin to look at options and alternatives, because as Connie said, this is actually about livelihood, it's about survival, it's about adaptation, and we can't lose sight of that. This is an imminent threat to well-being. So how do you tackle that? We have to immediately look at efficiency, and we can have tremendous savings of energy if we focus on efficiency. And secondly, we have to understand that land use, the way we farm and the way we forest, contributes about 30% of all the emissions. So if you look at the impact of deforestation on the burning of forests, on the CO2 load, it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of all the CO2 emissions. And that's twice all the combined emissions of the entire global transportation sector. And the interesting thing is that we actually can get a handle on that right now. And if there was one really positive thing that came out of Copenhagen, it was an agreement by all nations that own forests to reduce emissions that come from deforestation. And that was a big step forward. At the same time, there was an agreement by developed nations to put about $4 billion into kind of fast track, let's prove it, let's do it, let's actually compensate the DRC and Liberia and Brazil and Indonesia and other nations by giving them the financing to reduce deforestation and have income generated for communities, families, and for nations. Right. So that's the good news. But we need to act right now.
Well, the Conservation International has a project along those lines in the Congo. Could you explain how it works?
Sure. We have actually projects. We've done projects on reforestation to reduce emissions in China. We've done them in Ecuador. We've done them in Brazil, in Madagascar. We're on a major one in Liberia right now. The one in the DRC is very interesting. About 2 years ago, we launched something called the Carbon Fund. And the Carbon Fund is an opportunity for companies that want to voluntarily reduce their emissions, because right now it's not mandated, but to voluntarily reduce their emissions. And it's an opportunity to find appropriate projects in countries that if you stop deforestation, you'll offset the emissions of a company by a reduction in emissions in a nation. So Disney made a commitment to us of $7 million to offset their emissions, and we applied all those funds to a deforestation effort in the Congo. The significance of it, it's not that big an area. It's maybe 350,000 hectares. The importance of it is not that scale, that particular one. It's just to demonstrate to a nation and to a community that there's real money available when you change your land use pattern. And there are many, many companies that want to participate in this. The real thing we have to do is we have to put a price on carbon, and we have to make this a part of the private sector of the marketplace, because then we're going to go from tens of millions or hundreds of millions into billions of dollars that can flow into nations, developing nations that are looking for legitimate alternative livelihood for their people.
Right. Now, another element of the formula is putting a price on carbon, and we mentioned that. And Peter Voser, could you give us your view on the likelihood of us getting a price on carbon? I mean, you are in the carbon business, and you keep a close eye on this. The climate bill in the United States Senate is stalled, and as we mentioned with Connie, we didn't get as much progress out of Copenhagen as we might have liked. Are we going to get a price on carbon so that the developing world can start to afford these alternative technologies, or is this a political pipe dream?
No, we are a very strong proponent of a carbon price, and I think it should be ultimately market-driven. Now, like a cap and trade system. Now, you can get to that in stages. I think important is that we start to move, we start to build on where it is already in place, or at least tried like in Europe. For a company like we are, and I think for any company who is investing in technology, you want some certainty longer term that your investments for the next 30, 40 years actually can be put into an investment climate which is key. And I think the cap and trade system or any market-based system is the only system, in my opinion, which allows you actually to reduce over time the CO2 caps, and therefore you will trigger the right innovation, you will trigger the right investment pattern. But I would like to link this also, if you give me 1 minute more, to what was just said, which is let's start with things we already have. So, for example, in our company, I've made it after Copenhagen very clear. There are a few things we can do now. Let's go and move. One is we focus even more on gas than we have before. So we are by 12 producing more gas than oil in our company. Energy efficiency inside our operations, but also giving products to the customers that they can actually save it. Carbon capture and storage, which I think needs to be recognized as a mitigation technology that we can actually prove that the technology works and moves forward. And then the fourth one, for the next 20 years, we see only sustainable biofuels as an option to actually reduce in the transport side the carbon emission in a bigger way. So that's what we are working on now. And for all of this, to have a carbon price would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Connie, can we get an international agreement? I mean, can we get over 100 countries to agree to put a price on carbon? And what's the likelihood? Is that what is needed?
Well, I'm not in the predicting business, but basically what we saw in Copenhagen was 120 leaders said, we think we have a co-responsibility here. We want to do our fair share, common but differentiated, we will contribute. And more than 130 countries have now submitted to the Copenhagen Accord. More than 75 countries have actually come forward with reduction targets. I think that it is possible, and I think it must be possible. That is, and we can hear it from business, we hear it from everyone who's dealing with this, they need a price signal. And that's also why some of us still bothers with these international negotiations, although they are very, very slow and irritating and frustrating. There is this chance that we could develop in due time a global price on carbon. I think that right now, the US has a huge responsibility seen from the rest of the globe, because we have had for a long time a price on carbon in Europe, a cap and trade system in Europe, and it works. Well, yes, it took some few years to make it work. Now it works. Japan is developing a system. Others are developing their systems. it would be hugely important if the American Senate would now accept that at least you could start with a cap and trade in your power sector, because then it's not a really wild idea, then it's within reach that in a tangible amount of years we would have an OECD cap and trade system, and then we could develop that into the global price on carbon. That would stir innovation, give the incentive for business to move in the right direction, and to make it more attractive to invest in anything else but coal.
But in the United States, the term price signal gets translated into tax. And right now, with a slow economy, nearly 10% unemployment.
You made a bank tax now. I mean, who would have thought that just one
Well,
one year
everybody
back?
is upset with the bankers. So, Peter, you're in Washington, D.C., and you talk to senators on a regular basis. Do we have a chance of getting anything out of the United States? Because if the United States and China basically don't come up with some sort of serious agreement on climate change, I mean, we're not going to make it, right?
So I don't live in Washington, D.C., to be clear. I live in Seattle. And I live in Seattle, so I don't have to be in Washington, D.C. I actually have spent a lot of time in the last several months with different political leaders talking about the question. And I see in private conversations with many senators on both sides of the aisle a real understanding that a price is necessary, whether it's a cap and trade or whether it's a carbon tax that's offset by a reduction in a payroll tax, so it's revenue neutral. There's a lot of good conversation taking place. Right now in Washington, D.C., there is a untenable political gridlock. And so things have to be shaken up, and I think it unfortunately is very much personality driven right now. So I'm not that hopeful at the moment. In the long haul, in the next, this year, I'm more optimistic. What has happened that's really important is, which is a devastating tragedy, is the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And what that spill has done is it has really awoken in the public in every corner and every camp an understanding that if you undervalue nature and you undervalue the services that healthy nature provides, people really get hurt. And so that's created a new level of discussion about what are the options and what are the solutions. So there will be bills that will look at energy. There will be bills that will look at national security. There will be bills that will look at environment. All of them are going to have components that will deal with carbon emissions or carbon pollution. And so I think that the whole situation has been shaken up by the spill, and there could very well be a very significant silver lining to this. What just the last point I would say is that if this spill had not taken place in the Gulf of Mexico and had taken place off the coast of Africa or taken place in Indonesia, the discussion of carbon would have been dead in the United States. But because it's a front page story right now,
There's a silver lining there, yeah.
that there could very well be a breakthrough.
Yeah. Kannan, South Africa has this aggressive carbon target. How's it going to be enforced? How are you going to get there?
Sure. I think in South Africa we're going to use a combination of mechanisms. The one is we don't have a carbon market. We don't have a power market. So it does require government policy, and it does require South Africa to be able to access external carbon markets as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination. So some of the attempts, for example, is how we got our solar and wind projects funded through the, in a sense, the CDM. Energy efficiency projects, we hope to get between 8 and 15% over the next 10 years from business as usual, targets reduced, and see if we can also get some of that funded through the CDM. Our technology shift, though, to low carbon technologies is going to be the challenge.
Right.
Because if you just look at the
it's
price,
all interrelated, right? We've got to get a price on carbon and drive down the price of technologies like solar and wind, therefore countries like South Africa can afford to develop them, right?
Exactly. That's going to be the major challenge, because if we just had to fund it out of the tariff is going to really go significantly high. Our estimate is from a business as usual target, we would have to increase the price by up to 30% more. Right. As it is, it's going up quite significantly. Yeah. That's if you just had to fund it finance it, out of the tariff. Obviously, you can have other financing mechanisms.
Right.
And that's just to give you the scale of the challenge.
Now, I usually try to remain an optimist about the environment, which is a challenging job. But if these targets don't work, are we facing a world where adaptation really becomes more and more important? One of the things that came out of Copenhagen was the United States and pledged, $10 billion a year for adaptation. Connie, could you first explain what that means? And then, Kannan, could you tell us some of the changes you've seen in the South African environment and the climate that would require adaptation funds?
Well, adaptation, that could be how to take better care of your farming, for instance. If you know that the seasons are changing and you're living in a developing country, you cannot use the knowledge that you inherited from your forefathers, when then to sow, when to do that. Maybe you should have some other crops because they will be more resilient towards drought or flooding or whatever is the consequence in your area. That's the kind of thing where we could disseminate knowledge much better and help making developing economies much more climate resilient. So that is why adaptation is a very important part of this equation. It's adaptation and it's mitigation, and in some countries it will more or less be 100% adaptation. That's why it's so important that the money that the developed countries pledged in Copenhagen.
And how much was it in
that
total?
was all in all $30 billion combined for this year, next year, and 2012. In this 3-year period, $30 billion. And that is called fast start money. And that means that they must be there now. We must deliver. We cannot once again pledge at a fine international conference and then in the end, the developing countries can see that the money never comes. In Europe, we have pledged and we have also now showed how we can deliver that. And it's important that now the projects start to be there, because I can tell you that the need out there is just so that we cannot imagine how big.
And then we were talking earlier about some of the physical changes you've been seeing in South Africa. Could you give us one or two examples of that?
I mean, generally, as an electrical utility, we also have seen changes in the way we have to manage our system. But from a country perspective, clearly on our western side of our country, getting drier and concerns about increased frequency of droughts. On the eastern side, we're seeing, our shoreline being affected. We're seeing more hot and humid conditions and a lot more rain in some areas. It's affected, for example, our logistics. We're concerned, for example, we've seen malaria areas going more westward. So these are things that we've seen in the last 10 years.
So the adaptation dollars, if South Africa were a recipient, could be used to help mitigate some of those effects. That's the idea?
That's one example, yeah. I think we have to look at both mitigation and adaptation in South Africa, clearly. But some countries would have to look at adaptation as well.
Now, Peter, I want to become an optimist again. So could you tell us some of the technologies that Shell is working on that could give us hope that we could really reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? I know you're working on carbon capture and sequestration technologies. You're working on advanced biofuels, cellulosic ethanol. What's out there? I know there's no silver bullet. We're going to need all these different technologies, but where are you putting your money these days?
I think the first one is actually gas. That's where a lot of our investment money goes in, which is really, some call it the bridging fuel, I call it more the long-term solution. It has versus coal 50 to 70% less CO2. Capital intensity-wise, if you replace some of the older coal plants with gas plants, it's actually the lowest capital intensity you can have. And I think that's where we actually should go in. If you have a world which struggles to find the right finance, let's not go to the most, let's say, expensive technology. Let's use what we have today in order to go forward. On the biofuel side, yes, indeed, we are doing a lot of research. 25% of our research and development budget is actually in biofuels. We are looking now at sugar plants to go straight into gasoline or into diesel as one of the potential long-term projects. But we also negotiating a rather bigger joint venture in Brazil using sugar ethanol, which has around 70% less CO2, as a solution which we could actually bring to the market rather fast. I think CCS is a technology which we need as a mitigation. I think we know all the individual components of the technology, but we need to urgently scale it up and use it in a bigger way that we actually know it works. We have taken a final investment decision on the biggest sequestration project in Australia, in an LNG development there. We are looking at one in Canada and a few other places. So I think that's another way forward. So I think in general the way I describe it is actually we will, as Shell, and I think other companies will be the same, we will not put money everywhere. We will concentrate on a few things where we think we can make, with our skills in the company, with our innovation and technology drive, we can make a difference, and a difference in the shorter term. And that's how we are looking at this. So we were criticized a lot because we went out of solar, but we think solar will be part of the energy mix, but it's not a business Shell wants to play. Therefore, we use those funds and do something else.
Could you briefly give me a scenario, which is a Shell word, right, of 2050, and what our energy mix would look like, and will that energy mix allow us to, mitigate the effects of climate change?
Yeah, this will most probably feel like a cold bucket of water now, but let me try. I think we look at the world, which will go from 6.8 to 9.2 billion people, mainly obviously in the developing world. We think that energy will actually develop in such a way that we will have twice as much energy than we have today. So we have to double it, but obviously at an environmental cost which is much lower. We still think by then that around 60% will be fossil resources. 33% will be, or 30 to 40% will be renewables, including nuclear. Why that? Couldn't we do more? I think it's the 30 years rule, which I already mentioned. It takes a long time to develop. But I think you also need to think about if you double your energy needs and requirements, and at the same time, in renewable terms, you come from a 2% world market share and you go to 30 or 40%, the growth rate is going to be phenomenal. And the industry needs to develop this. Countries need to have the right rules, need to support it, may have to support through subsidies. So this is a gigantic task which we have ahead of us. So I think, if we like it or not, we will have fossil energy being with us for quite a while, hence the drive to make it actually a lower carbon world in order to bridge into an energy future which will have much less of the fossil fuels like we know today. Mm-hmm. But it will take 4 or 5 decades before we see a fundamental shift there.
Connie, is that too long?
Well, I think that the proportion for fossil fuels, as I just heard it, is very, very high compared to what we need. But basically, I agree that we will have a significant increase in energy demands for many, many decades to come. So I think that despite of the technology innovation that we need in Europe, we are right now trying to invest in 12 CCS plants and things like that, demonstration projects. There are many, many things we can do and should do. We should also have mechanisms that take care that when we have the technologies there, that we have market forces that make it attractive to disseminate it also to the more developing parts of the world, instead of just having it for the very few. And then I think that energy efficiency, I mean, we always talk about these fancy technologies, but there are so much to be gained in increased energy efficiency. And you can just, each of you, think of how much energy we waste, where we could just use it much more consciously.
Right. Well, there's a famous McKinsey study that shows we get 40% of the way to our
the huge resource that we
targets
still have.
just to efficiency, right?
But it needs also not just the industries, it needs the politicians and we all as societies to step up and actually confront it. You will most probably not win votes by telling people that they can drive less so they have to pay more, but that's what actually is needed. And this is on the energy efficiency side, we need to drive this.
Peter, how do you sell that to the public, that idea?
I think that the most important, first of all, we have to look at our language. I mean, it is remarkable the words we use and how incomprehensible they are. I mean, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, these are words that don't resonate with anybody. And so we have to really be thinking
Well, drill
about
baby
that.
drill resonates, right?
Yeah. So, did you come up with that phrase?
Yeah, I copyrighted it. Yeah.
So I think that we have to look at number one, we have to look at our communication. I think it's extraordinarily important for us to really understand that this discussion is not about nature, it's really about people. And it's a core understanding that humanity needs nature to thrive. And that means that nature provides us with certain services. So our climate stability comes from nature, and our water comes from forests, and our food security comes from coral reefs, for example. And what we've done so far is grossly undervalued the contributions that nature provides, so that we didn't even think that there was a value to trees in terms of carbon mitigation until 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I think that one of the things that we're going to learn is that the public will have to demand this, and the public will demand it. If you look at just the increased awareness and concern in the Gulf states, in the United States today versus 3 months ago, there's a sea change in interest and concern about how do you take care of nature. And I think that's really important. I think the other thing that we need to really acknowledge is that this past decade has been a remarkable decade in terms of increased understanding and awareness and discussion about this topic. Mm-hmm. There are more businesses, more universities, more nations, more researchers thinking about these issues than ever before. So I think the future is a little bit unpredictable as to where the breakthrough is going to come from and when they are going to arrive. So I hold hope for very positive, changes, because I do think, just one last example that I'll give. 5 years ago, we began to work at Conservation International with the largest retailer in the world, with Walmart. Mm-hmm. And the conversation really was about it's important for your customers and important for your company to be able to do a better job in terms of the environment. It happened to hit that conversation. That conversation took place at the moment when Lee Scott, the CEO, had his first granddaughter. And he was actually concerned and interested. And it became a company-wide engagement. The significance is that they started setting some important targets. They were going to reduce energy use in their vehicle, their fleet, by 40%. They set targets. They've achieved those targets. They are going to require all suppliers to ship materials in supplies and recycled materials. Mm-hmm. They've saved $300 million a year in terms of having to take things to the waste, to the garbage dump. And they've said to every supplier, if you want shelf space, you got to become green. So that's 100,000 suppliers. They have a remarkable engagement this is just one company, but they have a remarkable engagement in China. So the point I'm trying to make is that we are in a moment of tremendous transition in a conversation that has never taken place. And so no matter what we talk about, the tide has begun to turn. Mm-hmm. And whether it's going to be 30 years or 40 years, it's turning.
Yep. Okay, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience here. Do we have a microphone and any questions for our panelists? Up here in the front.
Mary Robinson.
Please identify yourself, too.
Okay, Mary Robinson. I wanted to pick up on what Peter Seligmann was saying about changing the conversation, and I agree with what he said about that, but I would add that we need to change even the icons that we think about in climate change. It's not actually the polar bear on the melting ice floe or the melting glaciers that we need. It's the impact on human beings, particularly in this continent. Connie, you mentioned that you'd been to Mali, and I know what you would have said. The really dire impact. And I did wonder whether there might be a possibility of opening up that debate now in the United States. I don't think there's any awareness in the public consciousness in the United States of the already damaging impacts on poor communities, on indigenous, on small islands, on many, many people on this continent. There were climate hearings before Copenhagen, and I remember taking part in one here in Cape Town with Archbishop Tutu, Arch. And we heard from 5 farmers from 5 different countries in Africa 4 of them were women, which was true. 70% or more of the farming is done by women. And the stories were very compelling. Constance Okellet from northern Uganda spoke about the fact that when she was growing up, there were seasons. There are now no seasons. It's flooding, then 6 months drought, then flooding again. The school has been destroyed. It's a group of women who are trying to hold that community together. And these were the stories in the different places. And
so the question is, how can we get that across?
I think it's how to
right?
make the connection with now people realizing the impact of the BP Gulf spill. I mean, I'm based in New York, and I can see how compelling that is and how worrying it is to people. Is it possible to get an interest again in the climate issue by showing the damaging impact on people, on very poor people, that we're undermining their life chances and their vulnerable development? These greenhouse gas emissions are very serious. They are, see, it's been a kind of science and technology-led and environment-led issue. But basically, it's a political issue. We have to put human beings there.
I would just say you have to segment the market, and I think that there are some of basically the discussion in the United States has gotten down to key senators, and we got to look at their markets and what is going to impact them. And so it's going to be effect on employment, opportunity for innovation and new technologies. And also, really importantly, what you just described is going to be what's the impact on people's lives and on their well-being. And those arguments have not been made effectively. And the language that has been used has not been effective. And I think that's what we're going to see. A very intense, it will be a smart, strategic campaign looking at key districts in the United States where there are vulnerable senators that want to make certain that they get reelected. And that's what it's going to come down to, because there are a few more votes that are needed, and then we're going to end up with something that's...
Well, you know, one interesting thing, Stuart Brand, who's written a wonderful new book called A Whole Earth Discipline, he said, you know, the environmental movement has always been about protecting nature, and now with climate change for the first time, we're going to have to protect man against nature and the effects of nature. The whole paradigm has been shifted upside down. So that's a messaging approach. Peter, how does a company deal with messaging on climate change?
Yeah, I think I would like to mention one thing which is quite important. We have these huge political discussions either in Europe or in the United States. As a company, we travel a lot, or I travel a lot, and I'm a lot in China as well. I would argue today that actually China is much more advanced in this particular discussion than most probably Europe and the United States are. And I think this is quite telling, because whilst in Copenhagen there were big discussions at political level, it was actually much more an economic discussion than a climate discussion, because it was about who has the right to grow in the longer term and how you grow and how the power is going to shift. But I think when you are today in China and you actually look on how they're driving their energy policy, they're driving it in a quite distinctive way, quite targeted way, developing all the various energies. I think they have overcome this already. They are in the implementation mode rather than in the discussion mode. And I think there's a lot for us to learn there, which would allow us actually to open up the discussion to deal with the problems you have just mentioned, a few of them, like in Africa. So I think we need to push certain things aside, get to the point and accept it and start to move and implement. And this is, for me, is the biggest issue. And I'm really sad to hear when we have need to convince a few key senators here or there. That's actually not, at least from an industry point of view, this is not my issue. I want to move on, and I don't care about that. Mm-hmm. And I think let's make sure that we are not overtaken in all of this by some of the emerging new developing countries, because I think they're actually ahead of us then.
All right. Connie, you wanted to say
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what we're trying to do in Europe is to say climate change is not just about climate change. It's about energy security, as you were also stressing, but it's also about security in general, because if, for instance, we do not handle this situation in Africa, in a global world, of course, people will start to move. Of course they will. Why shouldn't they? And they have the same right as we have to the good life. So, I mean, it's about security, it's about energy security, and in the end, it's about job. And I think that not too many people yet have realized how fast, as Peter just said, China actually is moving. It's right that around the negotiation table, China is not the fastest mover, but in reality, they're just doing this. They're creating more energy efficient product. They are now number one in wind.
Right.
They're number one in solar globally. And year by year, they take still some of the strongholds that other economies used to have. And I think that argument might also, in the developed countries at least, make people realize why this is also in our own interest. It's not just about nature. This is important enough. It's also about us.
Right, exactly.
Sorry, Pete?
Now, we have a question in the back here.
Yeah. Mine is just, I'm wondering, the Western world, including Americas, are the biggest polluters, and is well known when I look at California, the vehicles on the road. In Copenhagen, you promised developing countries a lot of funding in order to help them create afforestation and help to improve the world. But if you look now, the Western world is starting to blame us for pollution. Our vegetables exports, they're starting to call kilometer mile or something like that, that our export of vegetables are polluting the world by being shipped by air. Yet, all the goods imported from Europe, from America, come from the most polluting effect in their manufacturing plants. When shall we have equity? Who is suffering more and who has no compensation? It's the developing world. When you look at the flooding, which the lady mentioned there, it's affecting the very poor who have no recourse. Can you help to bring out injustices that are glaring, being seen, yet the media is not focusing and trying to protect the poor? Thank you.
Okay, anyone want to tackle that, Peter, or?
Sure. I agree. I mean, I think that it is the challenge that we have taken on has been to convince the developed world to invest in and support people in the developing world as they make changes that are benefiting everybody. And it is, it's absolutely the essential step to take. And it gets great lip service, and we get great pledges. And then when it comes down to the allocation time, it's no longer a priority because local needs become priorities. And it is a great frustration. We've been pleased that some nations, and I would really call out Norway, have stepped forward in terms of commitments, major financial commitments to the developing world to assist in compensation, equitable compensation for reduction of deforestation. Other countries have made commitments, but they have not delivered on them, and I'm nervous about whether they will deliver on them. So I think that we really have an important battle ahead of us, and we cannot stop, because what you're pointing out is a correct imbalance. I mean, it's an accurate description of the challenge. I wanted to add one other point, Brian, to what you said earlier. We are so convinced that this is not about just protection, biodiversity, and species and nature, but it is really about human survival, that we changed our mission this year from protecting biodiversity to supporting human well-being by protecting nature that gives services to people. And I think that's what we have to get to. We have to really fundamentally understand that this is all about our well-being.
Great, and I think that's a great note to end on. We've run out of time. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, Peter, Kannan, Connie, and Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
Connie, thanks.
Thank you.
Terrific. Conan, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the panelists. Now, it's time for a change in the program. It's time to go to the special sessions that we're going to have. We have 5 of them. I want to remind you, they are the special sessions on global security, lessons from China in Africa, disrupting disease, and clean tech for the developing world. I want to call special attention to the 5th session. That's called Unlocking Infrastructure, and it's the first one in our Africa Dialogue track. Our partner in all of this, the Department of Trade and Industry, last year launched an annual conference that they called Africa Dialogue, and it was a big success. So this year, the Africa Dialogue discussions are incorporated into this global forum. You'll see them throughout the program the next couple of days. With that, it's time to head for the special sessions. They are all upstairs, 2nd floor. Take the escalators up for all of them. There's staff outside to direct you. It's time to go straight there.